Remember that day, back in March, when the bell rang for the last time. We quickly came together as a community. Together, we rose to the challenge.
Olivier, il faut allumer ton micro.
And you were amazing. It is now time to register for the new school year. Register online at écolecatholique.ca. The Conseil des Écoles Catholiques du Centre-Est is here for you.
This is a CBC podcast.
The evidence is overwhelming that schools can be operated safely with little health risk for children and teachers.
Hi, I'm Ian Hannamansing in Vancouver, filling in for Duncan McHugh. This is Cross Country CheckUp, the podcast.
This does not mean there will be no cases in schools. It means rather we've made the best decision to serve the public interest.
Our question, are classrooms safe during a pandemic?
You can't ask teachers, A, to provide the supplies, and B, to do the cleaning through the course of the day. Their job is to teach.
We do feel that with proper precautions that it will be quite safe to go back to school in Alberta.
A lot of parents across the province find themselves in the same situation that we are. What's going to work best for our family and what's also going to work best for our work schedule.
Let's start with a pop quiz. Think back to the last time you went back to school. Was it A, exciting, B, pretty much like the year before, C, a little anxiety-inducing? For most of us, it was all of the above. But then came 2020, and like everything else in our lives, the familiar back-to-school routine has been shattered. The risk of COVID-19 remains, no matter what precautions are in place. And it's not just kids who will be learning during the school year. Teachers will be adapting on the fly, in-class lessons, distance learning, or a combination of the two. Health experts will be studying just how susceptible young people are to getting COVID-19 and spreading it to their families back home. The early indication is that children under 12 are less at risk, but there's still so much we don't know about this virus. Will your child be going back to school? Perhaps you're still trying to decide. And if you're a teacher, how are you preparing? Our question, are classrooms safe during a pandemic? Later in the show, I'm talking to Tina Montreuil, a child psychologist with advice on how to help your kids deal with the anxieties that come along with back to school during a pandemic. Plus, we have two stand-up comics in the AMA, Ali Hassan and Alonzo Bowden. They'll share their COVID comedy stories. Ali is fresh from a Just for Laughs drive-in performance in Montreal. I'm Ian Hannamansing, sitting in for Duncan McHugh. This is Cross Country CheckUp, the podcast. First broadcast on CBC Radio 1.
As a physician and as a parent myself, I encourage all parents across Alberta to include reusable cloth masks on their back-to-school shopping lists this year.
Throughout the program, we will be checking in with Raywat Deonandan. He's an epidemiologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Hello.
I am here. Yeah. How are you?
Excellent. Fantastic. Let me begin by asking you the question that we'll be putting to people over the next couple of hours. Are classrooms safe during this pandemic?
They're not safe at the moment, but they can be made safe. And that's what we're arguing is I would like to see making schools safe to be the number one priority for provincial governments before the fall. I would like to see them spend the money and the resources to make them safe. And thirdly, I'd like us to drive the caseload in the community as low as possible so that we have less of a risk when we open the schools. Right now, we're not there, but we can be there if we try hard enough.
All right. So much, obviously, to unpack with that really interesting answer, and we'll do that throughout the program. So stand by. Raywat Deonandan is an epidemiologist, and so we'll be able to put some of your questions to him. Let's get to the phone lines. There was an immediate reaction from parents after Jason Kenney tabled Alberta's back-to-school plan this week. Laura Mazzino joins us from Calgary. She has a 7-year-old son. Hello.
Hello, Ian. How are you doing today? Thank you for having me.
Well, very nice having you. I'm doing well. Let's start with the show question. Do you think a classroom can be a safe space during this pandemic?
No, I don't think that at this time, with the guidelines that our provincial government in Alberta has given us, would be a safe space for our child to go back to in-class learning.
So based on what you've heard about the plan, what is it that makes you uncomfortable?
The plan have done a good, produces good guidelines for teachers to provide in-class learning, but I feel that they don't go as far as they need to be in order to prevent an outbreak. I believe that the measurements are more suggestions, and teachers and school staffs are presented with an impossible task to try to accommodate large amount of numbers in enclosed spaces that are the perfect harvest environments for outbreaks. And I'm concerned about the second wave that is coming on the fall, and I'm concerned about the spread of the virus among children population.
You know, there's so many variables here and so many things that school authorities and teachers and parents and kids are juggling. Is there something, or are there a couple of things that the Alberta school system could do that would make you comfortable in taking your kid to school in September?
I think that, yes. I have read on a newspaper that there was a school-turned-childcare center in New York. And what they have done is that they have reduced the number of children in the classroom. They have accommodated for a staggering entrance, measuring temperatures of every child that comes in, and washing their hands, and doing random testing. And they have successfully have those children for 3 months with no cases so far reported. So I think that we can do better as a community. I think that parents, we can help certainly school staffs and teachers to provide with these services for the children to be tested and all the measurements to be implemented.
How has your son been doing, especially over the last few months where before the end of what would have been the school year, he wasn't able to go to school? How's he coping with that?
Our child, at the beginning, we were having a hard time in March because my mother and my sister that lives in Madrid, they contracted COVID-19 when the health system collapsed there. So March was a bad month for us. It took a long time for us to get the rhythm for the online learning system and just to get into a routine. Having said that, by the end of the school year, he was loving doing homeschooling to the point that now he's trying to convince us to homeschool him all the way to grade 12, which we will not do. Even though I'm capable of homeschooling him, we see the social and cultural benefit of him going to school. So we are looking forward for COVID-19 to be over, for him to go back to school.
All are looking forward to that. But if the Alberta school system doesn't achieve the kinds of things that you talked about that you'd like to see, is the plan in September and October, do you have a plan to continue homeschooling, at least in the short term?
That's right. The provincial government has given freedom to parents to keep them at home, and we will definitely take that opportunity to homeschool our child until a vaccine is available for us. I am concerned about the mental health of teachers that are presented with this impossible task of trying to accommodate 26 children in a classroom and still trying to keep 2 meters apart between desks. Also, little children are not meant to be sitting in a desk for hours at a time. And I understand that they have to reduce the circulation of children around the school, but I'm concerned that our child is not going to accommodate to that change. And we think that, my husband and I, we think that we can accommodate for a nurturing environment here, that he can still do academic progress at home.
Laura, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Ian, for having me.
Laura Mazzino is the mother of a 7-year-old in Calgary. Let's bring back Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. And Raywat, masks were a hot topic in Alberta this week. Calgary's mayor, Naheed Nenshi, said that he's considering mandating them in schools in his city. Do you feel that kids should be required to wear masks in school?
I don't see how we get around it, especially if the caseloads remain high in the community. Other countries have shown us the way forward. Several Asian countries have mandated masks, and I would say throw in face shields on top of the mask for that added layer of protection. We really can't tolerate this disease running rampant through our schools. If a couple of children get serious conditions and possibly even die, what kind of horrible tragedy would that be? So we do everything that we can, and that includes deploying the PPE, the low technology solutions like masks and face shields. Obviously, it's not possible for the very, very young. Children under 5, for example, probably can't manage to wear a mask healthfully or strategically or effectively. So other solutions need to be in place for them. But for the older kids, absolutely.
Now, in terms of ages of kids, I've read that especially for kids under the age of 12, even though we're learning more about COVID as the months progress here, it does seem that younger kids are less likely to get COVID, less likely to spread it. Would that be a reason to rethink masks, let's say, in that under 12 group?
No, and here's the reason. One is that data is still pretty unclear. For one thing, we don't really test children as much as we could have compared to adults, and so the information around children is pretty sparse. 2, even if they do get it less and spread it less, which is probably not the case, they do interact with a lot more people during the week than adults do, so are viable spreading media. They're disease vectors, pretty much. Every parent knows this. So it doesn't make them safer. And more to the point, let's say they infect one person, one grandparent, or one immunocompromised individual. That's a tragedy that we cannot quantify. So simply saying they are less likely to transmit may or may not be correct. It doesn't solve the problem. The problem has to be addressed through these more infrastructural and administrative approaches, building barriers, allowing distancing, wearing masks, spending the money, and more importantly, driving the caseload in the community as low as possible.
And my sense here as I sit in Vancouver and think about the briefings I've heard from the public health officer here, Dr. Bonnie Henry, and also those from Dr. Dina Hinshaw in Alberta, there seems to be a difference of opinion, though, kind of a reasonable difference of opinion among experts on transmission likelihood for people under 12. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, and the data across the world is, heterogeneous for sure. In Ontario, for example, the percent of tests that come back positive is the same for adults as it is for children, which tells us that the children are experiencing the same intensity of disease as adults are. In Korea, some data just came back from some contact tracing suggesting that those 10 to 19 are just as likely to spread it as those over 19. And for the extremely young, the sample sizes are too small, so I wouldn't take a whole lot away from that. We know for sure, absolutely, that children can spread it to both other children and to adults. Now, they may do so to a lesser extent, but they can, and they have been observed to do so. And children have been observed to get very, very sick, and some have unfortunately died. So these are the realities we have to deal with. And playing with probabilities may make some of the policy making feel a bit more evidence-based. But at the end of the day, when this is scaled up to thousands of schools and tens of thousands of people, we're going to have some problematic and tragic outcomes.
Speaking of children, we heard your very young child in the background. All the more reason to appreciate the fact that you are able to devote the next, more than an hour with us to answer various questions. So we will come back to you, Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. We reached out to Alberta's Education Minister, Adriana LaGrange, and in a statement she says that Alberta's comprehensive school reentry plan was developed in consultation with the education system and was approved by Dr. Dina Hinshaw, Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health. While the public health guidelines for school reentry do not currently include mandatory mask use, this is part of the statement from the Education Minister, students are permitted to wear masks if they or their parents would prefer to. We will continue to work with Dr. Hinshaw and adjust the guidelines as necessary. We would love to hear from you. Are you a parent, a school board trustee, or a teacher? Give us a call. Our question today, are classrooms safe during a pandemic? Workplace safety is something that millions of people across the country are pondering as they consider returning to offices, factories, and other workspaces. And that's certainly true for hundreds of thousands of school teachers awaiting news of their province's back-to-school plan. Alison Palmer is a grade 4 teacher in the Edmonton Public School Board. Hello.
Hello.
Now, you have seen the Alberta plan. As a teacher, do you feel safe returning to the classroom?
Well, I feel very anxious. I feel very anxious about, of course, my health and the health of my students and their families and my family. So I feel very anxious.
Yeah, and well, I mean, clearly a lot of people across the country do as well. You must have pictured the first day of school, I'm guessing, and you know, you've lived through it before. You've never lived through what we're likely to see this fall. How do you see that first day of school unfolding?
Well, when our premier made the announcement that we'd be going back to school, he used the term near normal, and that's a term that we hear a lot, that we're returning to near normal. And although, yes, we're going back full time and children will see their friends and their teachers, and we will still be learning, nothing about this is going to be normal. The safety measures that our premier has said we're putting into place will have huge effects on our day-to-day lives at school. And nothing about it will be normal.
You're a grade 4 teacher, so an elementary school teacher, and there'll be kids at your school, obviously younger as well. What hazards in terms of transmission concern you the most?
Well, obviously, one of the biggest concerns is the idea of physical distancing and how difficult that will be in an elementary school. So not just keeping apart in the hallways, but my first thought goes to my own classroom and what I can do in my classroom. And the furniture in my classroom currently, I have tables where the students sit 4 to a table facing each other. And so when I start thinking about what I can possibly do in my own classroom to physically distance these kids, I think, well, right now, I'm not sure what will come down the road, but right now the only 2 options I can think of are keeping them at those tables or putting them on the floor or giving them a chair and a space on the floor that they can choose between. So that's a huge decision that, again, just it affects obviously our everyday. And there's so many more decisions like that that we'll have to make.
Give us a sense of some of the conversations that I assume you've had with other teachers, other parents, perhaps. What are people in your circles in Edmonton saying?
Well, I visited with a teacher friend the other day, and our first thoughts are immediately to those everyday little things. And we say to each other, okay, well, what about this? And how will we handle this? And how will we handle sharing textbooks? And will I be able to provide my students with appropriate reading material? Because right now we share all of those. How will we be able to use Chromebooks? What about gym equipment? How will we handle a recess? These are that's the conversation we had. And I know for the 2 of us, my friend and I, we're quite lucky because in this case, we don't have children of our own. And I know for many of my colleagues, that's their first thought. They're not thinking about how they'll handle water fountains and reading. They're worried about their own children going back to school as well as all the things they have to think about as a teacher.
Although even in your case, what about visiting older friends or relatives once school starts?
Oh, exactly. I don't have children of my own, but I have nieces that I adore who are all going back to school, and my extended family and my parents who I think maybe I can't visit them for a very long time.
So what's the answer here?
Well, that's so difficult to say. I of course, I want to go back to school. I want to be with my students. I want to be in my classroom. I want to do my job the way it's meant to be. Online was okay, but I want to be able to do my job well. So of course I want to go back. I understand the economic argument to going back. I understand the concern around children's mental health the longer they're out of school. I understand all of those things. But I also know how risky this decision is. So what I would implore our government is that at the very least, they provide the funds for the plan they have announced. I understand that they have said they cannot do anything else. So I would ask at the very least, they provide the funds for more custodians. So we can actually do this enhanced cleaning that they speak of, that they provide funds for the appropriate furniture that I need for my 9-year-old so that they don't have to sit on the floor. That's what, and I would ask that they make the difficult decisions at the provincial level, like masks.
And what would you like in terms of masks?
Well, I would say, why wouldn't we do everything we can possibly do to protect our children and their families and our school staff and their families? Why wouldn't we do what we know now? And it's always changing, but it seems the longer we go through this, the more we have moved towards masks being an option, or not an option, but very important and very helpful. And so why wouldn't we do that? I understand there's probably some school boards where in their communities they haven't had a single case of COVID. And so, of course, there's always room to look at these regulations. But I would think it would make the most sense for the government to make that statement that we should be wearing masks. And I know there's the concern of, can small children wear masks every day? And of course, that will be a day-to-day thing we would have to deal with. But that's my area of expertise. I feel confident we could help them as much as possible to wear their masks every day. And while there would be issues, we'd make it work.
And I'm sure the concerns you have, and we can hear it in your voice and in your answers, are being felt by a lot of people across the country. Thank you very much for speaking with us this afternoon.
Of course. Thank you, Ian.
Alison Palmer is a grade 4 teacher in the Edmonton Public School Board, and we reached her in Edmonton. And as I mentioned, we reached out to Alberta's Minister of Education, Adriana LaGrange, and in her statement, her office says that they have provided school boards with an additional $250 million to support capital maintenance and renewal projects, of which $15 million was used for COVID-19 related infrastructure projects. Also, the minister has, quote, also approved the use of school board reserves totaling $363 million across the province to help cover COVID-19 related expenses. Let's bring Raywat Deonandan back into the conversation, the epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. Raywat, what advice do you have for teachers who are wondering about the risk that they may pose transmitting COVID when they come home and for example, are visiting older relatives?
This is very similar to what doctors experienced early on in the pandemic. Many physician friends were living in their garages, for example, so not to infect their families when they go to work, when they come home from work, rather. So the risk is real and the stress is real. And a lot of the resources we'll have to invest in going forward have to do with mental health of the custodial staff, of the bus drivers, of the teachers in particular. So the more we can spend money, throw resources at this problem, we should. And that includes making it safe, but also having counseling services and also having relief options for individuals who don't want to put themselves under this risk. Going to work in a school should not be a life-threatening endeavor. And it's unfair to ask people to do so. That's why it's incumbent upon a society to make the workplace as safe as possible. And it's important. I'm glad we're having this conversation. So maybe government will step up and make the right investments. I think it's possible to throw enough money at the problem to lower the risk substantially, such that teachers should not have this kind of anxiety. Other countries have shown us that it's possible.
We can all picture classrooms and hallways in schools. And so take us inside a school and describe for us maybe the biggest hazard areas when it comes to transmission.
The disease doesn't come from things necessarily. We call surface-to-surface transmission fomite transmission. It does happen, but it's not a major source of transmission with this disease. It comes from other people breathing on you, mostly from droplets, respiratory droplets, but limitedly from aerosol, things floating around in the air. So if we can limit people's exposure to each other, that's the primary thing to do. That means in a school, first, when you enter the school, use as many entrances as you can so that people are not clustered around doorways, and have staff monitoring to make sure that when students enter, they're wearing masks and face shields and are distanced. In the classrooms themselves, Desks should be separated. If we can, and we should, put up plexiglass or plastic barriers between classes. Again, Asian countries have shown us this can be done quite cheaply and effectively. And students wear masks and face shields while interacting socially. And teachers as well are wearing those masks and face shields. In the dining area, same thing, plexiglass barriers between dining areas. Gyms, unfortunately, will have to be closed. Any opportunities for clustering of people in an intimate fashion must be restricted. And the washrooms have to be deeply cleaned regularly. Again, this takes resources, it takes money, it takes hiring more people. We also have to keep the classroom sizes low, maybe a maximum 10 or 15 students per class, if not less so. That means hiring more teachers and leasing more space. So again, it's infrastructure. Add to that we need to invest in better filtering for the air circulation system, now that we know that aerosol transmission is a real risk. So installing HEPA filters can really help that scenario. So ventilation, distancing, and staying away from each other, as horrible as that sounds, are our best bets.
I wonder if there's a school board trustee listening to this right now somewhere in Canada, shaking his or her head, saying, Raywat, that is just impractical. How would you respond?
It's not impractical because, again, other countries have shown us that it's possible. So in Japan, they have a split class system, which each class divided into two groups to attend different times of the day. Students record their daily temperatures on a home inspection sheet, and they submit that record to their teacher every day. In Singapore, they've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their schools to put up barriers and thermal cameras, in addition to providing laptops for poor kids. They also provide emergency care for students whose parents are unable to take care of them. In Korea, you've got frequent temperature checks, hand sanitizing stations, desk disinfection. You've got plastic transparent dividers. Other countries have done it. And if this is going to be a priority for us, we should spend the money. I keep saying that. It comes down to spending money and getting the right resources in place to make our teachers and students safe.
All right, we'll come back to you throughout the program. Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist and an associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Stay tuned. Later in the hour, I'll also be talking to Tina Montroy, a child psychologist who says that kids will need extra help to cope with the stresses of back to school this year. She'll have a few tips for parents on how to do that. Our question today, are classrooms safe during a pandemic? So provinces across Canada are at different stages in terms of tabling their back-to-school plans. As we mentioned, Alberta and Nova Scotia have released theirs. Ontario and Quebec will be out next week. Caroline Alfonso is the education reporter for the Globe and Mail in Toronto, and she's here to give us a lay of the land across the country. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, Ian. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, thanks for being on. Alberta announcing the kids will be back in the classroom in September. No cap on classroom sizes. What's your assessment of the Alberta plan?
Well, I mean, it was expected. The education minister had said a few weeks ago that of the three scenarios that had been put forward, remote learning, a hybrid model, and full-time classroom learning, they wanted to go with full-time classroom learning. So we kind of knew that was coming. Several provinces, a handful of provinces actually now have announced full-time learning for their students. Mixed reaction to Alberta's plan. Expected, but the teachers union and a lot of parents are anxious about what this year will look like. It's going to be a very unusual start to the school year, and teachers want to know what will be in place when the year starts. Parents want to know as well, and we don't have those details as yet.
And what about the mask issue? We've already heard on this program it is a hot button issue, maybe not in the same way that it is in the United States, but still lots of questions, lots of controversy. Do you expect to see masks become mandatory in schools?
You're right, Ian. It has become a hot button issue right across the country. We're wearing masks when we go grocery shopping. We're wearing masks when we go indoors anywhere. Why aren't we wearing masks in school is the big question. Alberta has said that you could choose to wear a mask. Boards could choose it. Schools could choose it. What's interesting is in Nova Scotia, part of the announcement is that masks would be mandatory on school buses. and masks would be mandatory in school hallways and corridors of high schools. And the thinking there is that in an elementary school, kids generally are in that classroom for the entire day, whereas in high school, they're moving between classes and there's more traffic in those hallways, and masks would be useful then. So they made it mandatory in those two areas. It'll be interesting to see as this goes on, especially as Ontario and BC are expected to roll out their school announcements in the coming days, what their rules around masks will be. I know a lot of teachers and a lot of parents. I've heard from parents who have said to me, why aren't school boards telling us to have our kids wear masks?
Mm-hmm.
We could use the summer. We could use these days to practice mask wearing. This is an opportunity as parents to be able to do that. Let's use this time to make school reopening as safe as possible. So we'll see how these two provinces that are about to announce their plans, what they say about masks. I think everybody will be paying attention there.
But, when it comes to mask wearing, there are a few variables. And again, putting aside what's happening in the United States, where ideology seems to be driving a lot of the debate on masks. But one of the variables here in Canada may be the extent to which the virus is prevalent in that community. And I wonder if maybe that plays a little bit into why Nova Scotia has different requirements that they're suggesting for schools than maybe another jurisdiction might. And as an education reporter looking at the picture across the country, do you see regional differences on the back to school plan that seem to be tied to the state of COVID in those regions?
Well, I mean, what we're getting right now is pretty much high-level reopening plans, so provincial reopening plans. And then they're relying on the school divisions, on the school boards to sort of come up with how that would play out in individual schools. And that will differ regionally. Toronto, for example, may have something different than Timmins, Ontario, for example. So we'll see how school boards decide how school reopening will happen. But we're seeing sort of high-level discussions happening right now. So we haven't gone into the nitty-gritty quite just yet.
Looming over all of this, of course, is the potential of a second wave. And so as parents watch the news and see the COVID numbers across the country, are there things that they should be looking at, thresholds perhaps, that might give them a sense of what it would take for schools that reopen, that those schools might close again?
The way it works right now is that school boards are planning for various scenarios. They're in the midst of doing that. So they're in the midst of planning for what a full reopening with health measures looks like, what a hybrid model would look like, where, kids are in school part-time and at home remote learning part-time and full remote learning. And right now, even though provinces are announcing full-time schooling, we don't know how long that's going to last. Is it, if community transmission remains low, and that's probably key, if community transmission remains low, we could possibly keep schools open full time for as long as possible. But when we see case numbers going higher, as those fall and winter months set in, and as we know, Ian, I have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old at home, and they are little germ factories in the fall, as soon as schools reopen. If we see those numbers sort of tick higher, we could go into a hybrid model, or we could go back into what we had in March, April, May, and June, which is remote learning.
Well, I don't have to tell you, when it comes to education, you're dealing with province to province differences, region to region, as you say, the districts and divisions. And so that's going to complicate the back to school plan as well. Caroline, thank you very much for giving us some time this afternoon.
Thanks, Ian.
Caroline Alfonso is the education reporter for the Globe and Mail. We've reached her in Toronto. In the next hour, we'll have our AMA with stand-up comics. That's right, comics. Alonzo Bowden and Ali Hassan. They'll share some of their experiences doing stand-up during a pandemic, and they'll take your calls. You can always email questions to checkup@cbc.ca, chat in real time on Facebook Live, or tweet us at CheckUpCBC. We still have lots of time, though, on our topic today, and I know a lot of you want to talk to us. Perhaps you have kids or grandkids that are going to school and you're figuring out whether you have a plan B. Our question today is, are classrooms safe during a pandemic. And let's go to the phone lines. Adam Darcy has called in from Toronto. And do you feel that classrooms are going to be safe for back to school in the fall?
Well, I'm a teacher in a GTA school board, and I will say that as a teacher, my number one concern is whether or not students will feel safe, and specifically my main concern is their mental health. A social distance classroom is still a very unnatural way of communicating with both your peers and your teachers. And for students, my worry is that this may have a detrimental impact, or a full return may have a detrimental impact on their mental health.
So what do you suggest the school district does?
I think the best option right now, and I'll say this, as a teacher, I want to be back in the classroom, and I love teaching, and I missed my students from the months of March to June. However, I think remaining with the distance model is probably the best approach right now, and the safest approach as we currently know. As to my knowledge, I don't think there's any extensive studies to show whether or not a full return is completely safe.
So when you say the distance model, you mean to have the kids learning online?
Yes.
And what, can I ask you, what grade do you teach?
Right now I teach grade 5 and 6.
And so it's been a long time since I've had 10, 11-year-old kids in my house. My two sons are in their 20s now. But how did you have any experience at all with doing online or distance learning with your kids towards the end of the last school year?
So I did, and I'll say that I think my group of students did transition quite well onto the online learning. There are hurdles that you have to jump over, but for the most part, I think students do transition quite well to the online learning. And yeah.
Now, one of my sons actually is a school teacher here in Vancouver. He teaches high school, and I think, one of his experiences last year was kind of unequal access that kids had to online learning. Sometimes, whether they had proper internet connections at home, or whether their phones were kind of new enough to be able to handle the software that was being dealt with. Did you run into any of those issues?
We definitely did. There was times where, for instance, my internet would clonk out on me as well. So that's definitely one issue to navigate. However, I think that issue could potentially trump the mental health impact, as well as the health impact students as well as teachers might face with a full return to learning.
We've heard already during the program that there are models that can be followed. They're expensive, they're extensive as well, but they're models that can be followed that could make schools safe, or a lot safer than they are now, and you could open them up and you could have the advantage of kids actually being back in classrooms. How would you feel about that kind of approach?
Now, for me personally, I would be comfortable, as I'm a fairly young teacher. However, my worry is the older colleagues that I have, who I know who have expressed their concerns about going back to work, and the health challenges they may face, as well as going back to their families every day and potentially contracting the infection and spreading that to their loved ones.
Okay. Adam, thank you very much for calling in.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's go to Dave Reed now, and I hope I have the pronunciation of where you are in Ontario correct. Dave, is it Powassan?
It's Powassan, yes.
All right. You were a custodian in school, so you know a little bit about the challenges of trying to keep a school clean. So tell us about that in light of the question today.
Yeah, well, a couple of times we had a flu outbreak. And there was two of us in our school. We had about 300 students. We had to run through the school and each take an end and wipe down the desk and the computer keyboards. And at recess, we had 15 minutes. And then at lunchtime, we had a little bit longer. And we didn't even get out to the portable. And so I always got the flu shot because we're exposed to everything. If there's a sick student, we had to clean up. Now, the school board provided us with everything we needed. They gave us rubber gloves, eye protection, and mask, dust mask that we wore when we were cleaning up after sick students. So we had quite a challenge, but we had to wipe doorknobs and any touch spaces. So it was challenging.
And so what do you think of this idea of bringing kids back into schools of all ages during this pandemic?
Well, I think that it's going to be a real challenge for the younger kids. The older ones, they may be a little bit more sensible. I don't know, but the younger kids, they like to associate with each other. They play with each other, and they had toys and a sandbox and all those things that they shared. They played in. And so it's going to be a challenge for the teachers and the staff for the younger kids.
Yeah. Dave, thank you very much. And by the way, where is Powassan?
Near North Bay.
All right. Okay. Well,
It's
thank you very
about a
much.
20-minute drive south of North Bay.
Okay. Thanks for calling, Dave.
You're welcome.
Brendan Yates is in Vancouver and has recent experience with being in high school, although pre-pandemic. You graduated, Brendan, a couple of years ago, actually more than that, I guess, 4 years ago. How do you feel about this idea of reopening the schools this fall?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things that need to be looked at. As some of the callers have mentioned, mental health is a big thing that, so the obvious risk is getting the coronavirus, but the other kind of big part of it is the mental health aspect. So I think that the two parts in mental health that we need to look at is one, there's some students that rely on going to school, to see their their guidance counselors and their teachers, but also to see their friends, to provide that sort of structure in their life, or it's necessary for them to maintain a positive outlook, especially with everything that's going on right now. And the second thing is, if we have some kind of hybrid model here where some people come in and some people are able to stay at home and use their technology to use video calling and participate that way. So you have some students that are there virtually, and some students that are there in person. We have to keep in mind that the technology barrier is not going to be a great thing for the students that have to show up every day. And meanwhile, some of their classmates, maybe are able to stay at home because they have a nicer phone or a nicer laptop. So I think that's something that, I think one of the previous callers mentioned in Japan, they're distributing technology to their students. And I know some of the schools, have different levels of technology, just like different people have different levels of availability of technology. So I think that, some of the schools that have laptop carts and stuff, they could distribute some of those out to the students and, obviously check, who has what. And, I think it's really important that we allow students to come in if they feel they need to, and then the students that would feel more comfortable at home to create that option for them, but also to accommodate those that maybe aren't able to stay at home but would like to stay at home.
Sure.
So I just think that's something that needs to be kept in mind.
All right, Brendan, really nice hearing from you. Thanks for calling.
Thank you.
Raywat Deonandan is an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa, and he is listening in. Raywat, what are your thoughts to this point?
Yeah, it's important to remember that anytime we interject a technological solution to any problem, in this case, a technological solution is giving laptops to kids or even introducing a vaccine, technological solutions always follow along a socioeconomic gradient. So those with the greatest wealth tend to do better with it. So it's important that when we deploy these strategies to open schools, when we spend the money that I've been asking us to spend, that we do not lose sight that there will be those at the bottom end of society who cannot keep up, who need additional help. That includes the low income. It also includes those with disabilities. So a lot of these technologies aren't amenable to like blindness, deafness, some other kinds of disabilities. And so what are our strategies for accommodating those students? Particularly in public schools, less so in universities, we try to accommodate different learning styles as well. And the online experience isn't always amenable to a diversity of learning styles. So it really calls upon now the full creativity of our pedagogical experts across the country to really put together a new set of tools for us to deploy. I think it's possible. And I think having some in-class options in the hybrid model helps to assuage some of those concerns. But we can't lose sight that this will affect different people in different ways. And as always, the poor will suffer the most.
Mm-hmm. All right, we will come back to you in just a moment, Raywat, but let's go to the phones. Kelly Banco is a teacher in Edmonton, and you have concerns about this back-to-school plan, Kelly.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for taking my call. In general, I wouldn't feel safe going back to the fall as it stands now. I feel like schools in Alberta could have been made safe for COVID, and we've seen examples of that in other places around the world. But at the moment, as it is now, going back into what are at least most schools overcrowded and chronically underfunded schools, there are just too many students in one place for extended periods of time for me to feel safe with a respiratory virus. And that's the main thing. There's been talk and discussions about increased sanitation and things like that, and those are important. But with a respiratory virus, the critical areas to help are physically distancing oneself in limited numbers in enclosed spaces and masking, and neither of those have been made options by our government. Other places have tried or thought of hybrid models, and as I listened to the show longer, the epidemiologist that is speaking with you is, I think, hitting a lot of good ideas that could have been thought about or brought up with our government. But unfortunately, I don't think he was at the meetings with them, because that would have been excellent input. And then another thing I heard from the government about, possibly lower transmission rates, possibly. Looking at studies, I've seen maybe 80% levels, which is still pretty high for transmission, factoring in that those students are in overcrowded small spaces, 30, 40 students in classes for 7-8 hours a day, and then into the hallways and on the buses. Even with a slightly lower transmission rate, which again is from preliminary data, that extended exposure time just makes the odds and the chances go up, 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 and up. So with small amounts of data, instead of taking a proactive, better be safe than sorry approach, the government seems to have taken the let's just keep going and hope for the best approach, which with limited data and not much to go on, that doesn't seem very safe to me. And I mean, just by my age category, I'm not at the highest risk, let's say, with COVID, but I still have to wear masks and follow the rules around places too, and I have a slightly lower transmission risk than some people. And to not have some sort of support, except for that there is some mention about moving funds around that were already there. I believe maintenance funds, things like that. I mean, those funds weren't established for COVID back when they were established. They were for other things, but none of those measures are for a hybrid model or some form of online learning that could have been implemented come fall. And, I would love to be with the students in person. I think that's the best way to teach. Online learning, had ups and downs, pros and cons. Part of the problem with it too, I think, is it was really not so much online learning, but emergency pandemic, fly by the seat of our pants, 3 weeks notice online learning. So with a hybrid model and more developed online learning options for students, a lot could have been done. Instead,
sorry to jump in, Kelly. We've got lots of callers, but I do want to ask you one other question, and we just have maybe about 30 seconds for the answer, and that is, I mean, time is running low here. School reopening is maybe 6 weeks away. You are a teacher. You clearly have misgivings. So how are you going to handle that?
Well, I guess I have to show up for work. I'm going to be wearing a mask, and I guess I'll be hoping for the best and trying to do my best having students be feeling as safe as they can in a situation like that. And that's the position I'm forced to be in, but I will try my best.
All right. Well, that's a tough position to be in, obviously. And Kelly, we wish you the best. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you.
We get a lot of calls from Alberta, which is not too surprising when you consider that this is one of the places that rolled out its back-to-school plan, and there has been a lot of conversation about it. Keep in mind, we're looking to hear from all of you across the country because this affects classrooms or will ultimately affect classrooms across Canada. Do you feel your classrooms are safe during a pandemic? Our number is 1-888-416-8333. 888-416-83333. You can reach us on Twitter at CheckUp CBC.
Hi, I'm Leah.
And I'm Phelan. You know us as the hosts of the podcast, The Secret Life of Canada.
And we've got an exciting bit of news for you.
We do. We want to go to school with you.
That's right. We are now part of the curriculum in a way. We've teamed up with educators from across the country to create teaching guides that go along with some of our best episodes.
We've got teaching guides for Indigenous history,
Caribbean Canadian migration, Black history, Asian history. It's very exciting.
It is very exciting. And so each guide comes with ad-free audio, transcripts, lesson plans, slideshows, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, just head to cbc.ca/teaching guides for more info, and it's free.
It's free.
The theaters have closed, but the show will go on.
Play Me Podcast is thrilled to present a new series, The Show Must Go On, featuring provocative productions from some of North America's most acclaimed creators for the stage. Sit back and experience everything from chilling thrillers to gut-wrenching dramas to irreverent comedies.
Each month, experience the exhilaration of theater from the comfort of your own home. Play Me, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Martin de Groot is in Edmonton, and how do you feel about kids going back to school in, about 5 or 6 weeks' time?
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.
In my family, we've decided that, my wife decided, and I support her, that as long as there's COVID-19 in the country, we can't send our children to school. The risks are just too great. One of the issues that I guess I have is these cases of, I don't know if I'm saying the word asymptomatic, those that aren't showing the symptoms. So the kids go to school, they're going to get thermal tested. What about the ones that aren't showing symptoms but are passing the virus on to others? By the time it gets known that they're passing on the virus, we've got a huge outbreak in a school with thousands of children. So that's where we stand. As long as there's the virus, we just can't risk it. We can't risk it for them. We can't risk it for our family. Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier on in the program that we reached out to the education minister in Alberta and got a couple of statements back, or a statement back. And one of those statements says that the plan in Alberta has been signed off on by the chief medical officer, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, who I know has, a lot of support and I think has a lot of support and a lot of respect among Albertans. Does her sign off give you comfort?
No. I hate to say this. I don't know. Sometimes there are things politically motivated. Unfortunately, it comes down to that. I just can't risk, if there's a political motivation just to get things moving again, to give to make it look like everything's back to normal. I mean, we've got more COVID cases in Alberta now than they had when they initially shut the schools down. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me to put the kids back in that scenario.
But what do you think the motive is for? Why do you think the government is supporting this plan if you're so sure it's not safe? What would their motive be?
I mean, there could be pressure from interest groups, two-parent working families. They need their children somewhere safe, not at home. When I say not safe, I mean, somewhere other than in front of a computer at home. That could be some of the pressure from the government there. And even just the what's I'm looking for, to look like everything's back to normal so that Alberta's economy can get firing back up again. I mean, let's face it, this has hurt. It's hurt us all. They want to get things back up and running to get Alberta back to the way to sort of what it was, and this may be part of that plan.
Martin, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for expressing that point of view. Let's go to Abbotsford, BC now, and Jade Frund. Is that how you pronounce your name, Jade? Hi, Jade. Can you hear Ian? Maybe not. I'm going to try one more time and see if do we have a caller on the line from Abbotsford?
It was connected to my car, but I'm on my phone now. Thanks for taking my call.
I've been through that myself, but you can hear us loud and clear now?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
Okay, you are in favor of sending kids back to school. Tell us why.
Yeah, well, you know what? I have 2 kids in the school system. They went back for the temporary reboot in June that we did in BC. It was voluntary at the time. It was great. And out of all of the school, well, I guess our whole province went back. There was...
Okay, well, we lost Jade. Maybe we can connect with her again because it's kind of nice to hear a caller from Abbotsford, but also someone who obviously feels very comfortable with their kids going back to school. I think we're going to go to Catherine now, who is in Ontario, and she's asked for anonymity. I know there's been some discussion on the program, and that anonymity has been granted. And Catherine, tell us your perspective on this question about kids going back to school, particularly in your town.
Well, hello, Ian. My concern is I work with high-need students, for the most part, students who work on and live with an autism diagnosis, and they have certain issues with regard to life skills and hand washing and bathroom protocols and coughing and spitting and kicking. And I absolutely love my job, but my concern is that when Premier Ford and the director of Lecce come out with their mandate this coming week, I'm wondering and concerned if they're going to have those specific students in mind, because there will be concerns raised by the parents of those students and by the staff that work with those students. I'm just wondering if they're going to be considered.
And so how would you like to see things unfold in the fall?
Well, I don't want to fearmonger, but there will be students who, in theory, if everything is going back as they say, there will be students on the spectrum who will not consider wearing masks, who will not understand about proximity. And so will those students now be relegated to a specific area of the school, or will they be integrated into the classroom? Because, not to be the fearmonger, are there other parents who are now going to be concerned that those high-need students are going to be in proximity with their children?
Mm-hmm. And you sound relatively matter of fact about this. Do you have a sense, a feeling of anxiety? Because we've certainly heard anxiety from other callers this afternoon.
Well, the reality is we're working with a pandemic that we can't see. I mean, if it was a giant orange ball that was tethered to everybody's body, we could see it, but we can't see this thing. When the students arrived to the school, who was going to be in charge of doing temperature checks? What happens if little Jimmy's temperature is a little bit high and the parents refuse to take Jimmy home? Who's going to be responsible for little Jimmy until the parents come to pick him back up? There is anxiety. I know that during the summer, this is a very relaxing time, but we are starting to think about September, and there are so many variables in place that I am concerned that a lot of the different little items are not going to be addressed ahead of time, and it's going to become a concern starting the end of September because we're going to see a ricochet effect.
Okay, Catherine, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Ian.
We have Jade Freund back on the line. Now, am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
You are. So sorry about that disconnection.
No problem. So you're calling from Abbotsford, and we heard a little bit from you before your phone did disconnect, but you are in favor of sending kids back. So let's pick that up again and tell us why.
Yeah, so I sent my kids back in June. They did a month-long restart in June just as a voluntary. You could send your kids back if you wanted. It was really, really positive here in BC. The parents that sent their kids back had, felt really, really great about the measures that they had put in place. And in the entire month of June, in our entire province, there was 0 cases of COVID among kids that returned to the school system. And like our provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, has been really clear that the data doesn't show that kids pass it among other kids or that kids pass it to adults. It can go the other way. Adults can pass it to kids. But I don't know, like your caller, your guest that called in and said that he thought that kids should return with mandatory masks is absolutely ridiculous. You could never have an elementary age kid wear a mask all day long in a classroom. They would be fiddling with it constantly. It wouldn't protect them from anything if they're touching that mask 500 times in a day and then touching other things. It would be absolutely more dangerous to put kids in masks for an entire day than not.
Yeah, I think
you're outside with a mask on. You can't do that.
Yeah, I think your point of view is first of all, this is such a personal issue for people, right? So across the country, people have their own points of view, but I think to an extent, you reflect how different the perspective is among many in British Columbia. And you mentioned Dr. Bonnie Henry, the medical health officer,
right,
who I think, has had a different perspective on this than a lot of others across the country.
She's been really, really reasonable. She's been really reasonable. She made it absolutely voluntary to return in June. She made it voluntary if you wanted to wear a mask. So my daughter's teacher wore a mask. My son's teacher didn't. The return to school is really positive. They had a lot of outdoor time. They divided up the recess time so that the school was actually in 3 different recess blocks, so only a third of kids went out for recess at a time. They had designated playgrounds so that there wasn't a lot of interplay among classes. So, my daughter knew she had this section of the forest to play in, at that recess time today, and their other classes had different playgrounds that they were designated for that day. It was just really positive and reasonable. And the thought of not sending my kids back during the whole pandemic because of being afraid that they would get it, when the possibility and the data shows that it's so low of kids getting it, would just, I think, really be really disruptive to their mental health. I know having my kids home during that time of the 3 months that they were home was absolutely a negative experience. I couldn't even get them to exercise at all because, they couldn't go outside and ride their bikes with friends. And you can't make a kid go ride their bike around the block by themselves. They don't want to do it. So they had very limited physical activity for the 3 months they were home, whereas when they went back to school, they were playing with friends again. They were playing with friends on the playgrounds after school. They were seeing their friends after school. It was just an absolute improvement for their mental health. And I don't know, the thought of sending, the World Health Organization right now, I just looked at the data this week, and they don't even recommend that people wear non-medical masks. I was just reading, this is the quote that I screenshotted. It says, non-medical fabric masks are being used by many people in public areas, but there has been limited evidence on their effectiveness, and that WHO does not recommend their widespread use among the public for control of COVID-19. So I don't know how people are still recommending people wear non-medical masks, unless they said you can't physical distance, like on public transit, then they do recommend them. But, they did, kids can't physical distance, but kids are different. They're not passing it among each other. Otherwise, you would have seen at least one case in the BC return.
So many calls, and we should move on very quickly, but I do want to ask you this. You're our first caller from Abbotsford this afternoon, the community just east of Vancouver. What about other parents? Are you the outlier, or are other parents in your group of friends, do they have a similar view as yours?
Well, I think in my group of friends, we're all sending our kids back. I have had a couple friends that have their kids in private school that have decided if the private school doesn't go forth and that they go back to a half-time system, which is kind of what we did in June, that they will end up pulling their kids and just homeschooling them this year because they don't want to pay tuition for a half return. I'm in the public school system. I have full faith that our teachers are doing their best to keep kids like in a classroom setting, when they have to be, and outside learning when they can do that as well. We're lucky here in BC that we can do that a lot of the year because our temperatures are warmer. But yeah, I have to send my kids back. They have to have some sense of normalcy. Children need normalcy. They're very adaptive, but I don't think it would be healthy to implement masks among young children. I just think that would have long-term effects on them. We don't know what they are, and no, I wouldn't be supportive of that.
Jade, really nice hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you for taking my call.
Let's bring back Professor Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. So, Raywat, when you hear a parent like that, what's your reaction?
Well, there's a couple of points of misinformation that need to be addressed. First is she said that children don't give it to other children. That's not true. That's been observed many times. In Israel, there was a famous outbreak in a school that affected 260 people, 150 of which were students. And we know someone just sent me some data, actually, a prominent scientist just sent me some data suggesting that children under 10 are 3 times more likely to be asymptomatic, which explains the dearth of cases of children in the data, right? So much of epidemiology is based on data bias, and this is one of the biases that's coming out. Children do not get tested as much. They're far more likely to be asymptomatic. They definitely are giving it to other children, definitely, there's no question of that. Secondly, is we need to think about what does it mean if someone does test positive? What does that mean for the rest of the school? Do you shut down the entire school? Quite possibly, right? What do you do to determine when society goes back in lockdown? Is that when a school has an outbreak? Quite possibly. These decisions have to be made beforehand. These thresholds have to be decided upon beforehand. So there's a lot of work to be done, and part of that work is combating misinformation, like that children do not get it or do not spread it. Absolutely, children spread it. The debate is, to what extent do they spread it?
So I guess I would restate, though, on the first one, it seems to me, but you're the expert, you tell me, but it seems to me that there are other experts who feel that the evidence, though incomplete at this point, but still that the evidence suggests that kids, younger kids, perhaps under 12, are less likely to spread it than older kids. Is that at least something which is that some experts believe?
Yeah, it's quite possible for a number of biological reasons, but less likely is not the same as not likely. And again, when this is scaled up to populations of thousands and tens of thousands of children, less likely becomes a lot of people. And a lot of people then become a lot of possible further explosions of cases in households that do not include children. So every child that's infected is a potential outbreak in a household. That's why we have to think about this. And that's why when a case is identified in a school, we have to have a plan to descend upon that case and prevent it from becoming a genuine outbreak. And that might include moving everyone online for a week until things are resolved. So this is the kind of planning that needs to be taken into account.
And quickly on the positive test scenario. So a kid tests positive in a school. If that student is in a small group, and let's say it's of 10 people, and that group is kept separate more or less from other kids, would that mean that instead of closing down the school, you might be able to just close down? Cohort is a word that's often used. You might be able to close down that small cohort for 14 days as opposed to shutting down the entire school?
That's an excellent way of looking at it, yes. So one of the rationales for having the cellular approach to socialization is that you can then just isolate cells of people rather than the entire population of a school. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the people don't need to be tested. Of course they do. But their movements probably don't need to be as restricted.
Mm-hmm. All right, stand by. We're going to come back to you in just a few moments. Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa, but I'd like to bring in Tina Montreuil, a child and adolescent and family psychologist, because as we've heard from a lot of people here on the program, there is a lot of anxiety, a lot of misgivings, a lot of uncertainty for teachers. A lot of them are going to have to just deal with that and come back to the classroom. And parents, as we've heard in some cases, are quite conflicted. We've reached Tina in Montreal today. Hello.
Hi. Thank
you very much. Yeah, well, thank you very much for lending your expertise to this conversation. What sort of advice do you have for parents who are uncertain about the safety of their kids here?
Yes. So I think the first thing is to say is, given the amount of uncertainty as has just been pointed out in the past few minutes, it's very normal to be feeling anxiety. Now, the idea is that, although it's normal, we need to, sort of find ways to be able to deal and manage this level of anxiety so that, we continue on with our everyday lives. And so essentially there are things that we can do. And one way of approaching this is sort of thinking about it in terms of what we have or what we can exert control over, and those sort of decisions or situational aspects that we don't have control over. Because a lot of the time we just kind of put them all in the same basket and we worry about the things that we can and cannot control. And therefore that just generates an amount of anxiety that is therefore afterwards difficult to manage. So by really sort of teasing apart, for example, decisions of whether we'll be going back or not, like those decisions are some that are not in our control. We can voice, for example, such as what your callers are doing now, things that are of concern to them, their opinions, but ultimately the decision is not ours. What we do have decision, however, over or control over are, for example, how we're going to manage the return, if return there is, how we're going to manage our children or things that are going on currently while we wait. And then with the things that we cannot control, that's a very difficult part. And sometimes that's why you need people like me to help you through it. But essentially, it's really accepting the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this pandemic. I think that's what's been most crucial about this pandemic, is that we are not quite sure. We weren't sure going forward from March onward. And although I think the months have passed, some things have become a little bit clearer. But as many experts have just pointed out, and parents, is that certain things do remain uncertain. And that's the part that's the most difficult to deal with, accepting uncertainty that this pandemic has thrown at us.
What should parents be watching for, and how should they help their kids as those children go back to school in the places where they do go back to school, wearing masks, being told they have to stay distant, all the things that are going to be so different, all under this cloud, I suppose, of a pandemic. How do you make kids feel less uncomfortable?
Yes. So it's twofold, because there are things, for example, that we can do in preparation of with our children. And then there are things that, we can do for ourselves. Like I always tell people, and I'm not the first to be using this analogy, but it's essentially putting on our mask first. Research has been shown in the past that the family climate, how our kids regulate their own emotions and how they deal with their own stress and anxiety, although sometimes they can't voice it, especially depending on their age, is that, parents, how we model our responsiveness to stressors, such as the ones, created by or generated by the pandemic, is essential. So when I say putting on your mask first, it really means that taking care of our own mental health or emotional well-being needs. So if there are things, for example, that we feel that we're not managing our own stress and worries about this pandemic, if we cannot do it on our own, because sometimes we can, with self-help and, it's, talking about it, having healthy life and balance, we can achieve it. But in other instances, maybe we cannot. And this is a perfect time, I think, that if we've been putting things on the back burner for years, that we've been dealing with stress or having difficulty dealing with stress, this is a perfect time. And I think you should not hesitate to really seek out help, because a lot of psychologists, such as myself right now, if let's say going out or going to a clinic is not possible, we do offer telepractice and telehealth via virtual means. The other thing is that I think maybe it's more for, and maybe that question was going to come and I'm going ahead of myself, but
That's
I think
okay. That's okay.
If going ahead, and this is very, very separate and distinct from an immunological perspective, because I'm not an expert on that, but I really do feel that if the decision is made by our decision makers or leaders, that children will have to go back. And I think that's probably, there's a lot of healthy things about that in terms of social emotional well-being, is that children's environment is going to be greatly, greatly altered, even though there are positive things about returning to school. And I think it's, again, there's another two aspects. And one aspect is that, we can't just expect that we're going to send our kids with all these sanitary measures in place and 100% go back to focusing on academics. Our kids are going to have had some, I guess, social emotional changes throughout these months, having been secluded, like what caller was mentioning, that her children have gone back in June, but for a lot of kids, that's not their situation. So they've been home since March. So that means that these children were going to have to, in the school setting, to really work at, addressing this social emotional baggage that some of them would have carried. And that's not to mention the smaller percentage of kids that will have endured trauma or other kinds of experiences at home. And the other thing is that what to me is of great concern is the teacher emotional well-being, because these teachers are going to come back and having to offer teaching and be in a mindset of teaching our children, with them having also to be told that they must put on their mask first, because just the same kind of relationship of modeling that parents can do in the household, teachers have the same power in schools to do that. So if teachers themselves are not well with the decision to go back, if they feel that there's not the right amount of support and measures in place within the classroom, that's going to generate a lot of anxiety for these teachers. And by default, I would almost say by 100% likelihood, well, that stress will be transferred onto the children. So that brings about in this, I'm totally in agreement that we have to start talking now about establishing clear protocols in terms of sanitary measures, but also start thinking, if we are to send kids back home, if there is an outbreak, how are we going to deal with the social emotional aspect of children as well, and teachers? But also in going back, we can't just assume that we're going to go back with differences in terms of how things are being carried out in the school and expect that teachers themselves will be able to do that work on their own. There has to be something at the systemic level that is put in place to psychoeducate and to assist teachers and children and families and parents on how to work collaboratively to make the experience of children more pleasurable, more positive.
Really important to hear your perspective. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Tina Montreuil is a child and adolescent psychologist, and we reached her in Montreal. Our AMA with stand-up comics, a complete change in direction. Ali Hassan and Alonzo Bowden is coming up in just a few minutes. Not easy doing comedy during a pandemic. I mean, really, what's funny about all of this? And yet, we probably need a little comedy more now than ever. Let's go back to Professor Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist at the University of Ottawa. Last comment from you.
Well, my last comment is the best way to open schools safely is to keep the community transmission as low as possible. That means possibly rethinking some of the ways we've opened up the economy in the last few weeks. Maybe some things just aren't worth experimenting with right now. I'm talking about bars and gyms and things like that. They're sort of luxuries. And if they provide an uptick in cases, that threatens our ability to have safe schools. Our priority has to be safe schools. Everything hinges on it. The economy, the long-term mental health of our children, as discussed by many callers. So I encourage people to think about keeping the caseload as low as possible, and I encourage governments to think about spending a lot more money to upgrade the schools.
All right. Well, it's been really nice hearing from you, and now you can go back to your young child who probably needs a little bit of care this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to squeeze in some callers before we get to the AMA, and let's go to Barrie, Ontario now. Cindy Ryder joins us, a parent of 2 children, and so obviously back to school is a big issue in your household, Cindy.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
And so do you think that the classrooms will be safe for your kids in the fall?
I really don't know. I am very concerned about it. I would prefer that they didn't go back to school until we had dealt with this. However, I know for their mental health or socialization that it's important for them to be able to interact with people again, with their peers. My comment is around the hybrid model. So I don't know why it hasn't been discussed at all, and maybe it's part of the provincial plan when they come forward with it. But I think that the hybrid model is better than full-time because it allows for smaller class sizes. However, the online component, I think, is problematic. I think expecting teachers to be running an online class simultaneously as an in-class is a lot of extra work. And especially for the younger grades, why does it have to be online? Why can't they send home worksheets or assignments that are not on the computer? I think would be a big help. So my son was in grade 1 last year, and when the school stopped, I got him a bunch of those little books that you can get with, problems and math problems and things like that. He was doing great and feeling really proud and really excited to do it. And, we were setting up a little classroom time. And then we went back to the school, and he has a phenomenal teacher. But the online component made him go from being a proud, happy kid to a frustrated and, less confident kid because the computer element was like throwing this whole, he's not just learning his assignments anymore. Now he's got to learn to navigate on this computer. And it was extremely frustrating for him.
And I worry that a lot of other kids, especially in the younger grades, it's just now on top of learning what they need to learn for their classes, now they're having to learn how to use a computer as well.
And so what is your plan for the fall? What do you think? I assume you're going to be taking your kids to school?
Yeah, I mean, I'm waiting to hear what the government has to say about what the plan is. If the school's open, we'll have to see. I would like them to go. Probably not going to do daycare like we normally would do, so just to keep that risk low again. But I hate to keep them home all the time when they're missing out on that. But again, even my daughter, she's going into JK. She's never been to school before, so. Mm-hmm. What's that going to look like for her? And again, I just can't imagine how that online works for those that are really young.
All right. Cindy, thank you very much for calling.
Thank you.
We have time for one more caller before we get to the AMA feature. Martin Hanzelek is in Mobile, Newfoundland. How are you, Martin?
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So do you think classrooms are safe? Give us the Newfoundland and Labrador perspective.
Well, our infection rates here are much lower compared to anywhere else in the province. But look, we're 7 months into a global pandemic, and if anybody's going to tell you that they really understand it well and know where things are going with COVID-19, they're either lying to you or they don't know what they're talking about, because things have changed a lot. And I think that if we're looking at things like reopening, we need to slack it back a little bit. Like you said, school starts in about 6 weeks. There's a mixed bag of opinions. Nobody's really sure exactly how transmission is going between kids. We've seen what happens when you open up too quickly. You just need to look at other countries and see infection rates, like in the U.S., of 1,000 plus a day. It's a big deal, right? And I think that a cautious approach is important. Now, there's a lot to think about. The social well-being of kids. Socializing is important. There's a technology disparity. You know that technology is going to filter up the socioeconomic ladder and not down, and we need to address that stuff. But to just open up with no restrictions or to haphazardly send kids back to school is really opening us up for a lot of damage when it comes to COVID-19. So I think a more cautious approach is needed, and I'd like to see if we're going to be going back into the classroom to scale it in. Our kids have done really well with learning from home, using Zoom, using the technology solutions. And I think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on that. I'm really fearful about the opening up of the schools and what that's going to do to the spread of the virus.
We have less than a minute for the rest of this call, but let me just ask you, for your 11-year-old son, what's his state of mind?
Well, Silas is sitting here with me, listening to the radio show, and he definitely has anxieties about going back to school, what it's going to look like. Is there going to be mandatory masking? How are the desks going to look? And we don't have those answers, right? Mm-hmm. We don't know what it's going to look like when we go back to school here. And I think if you're 6 weeks out during a global pandemic and you're, waxing and waning between ideas of what it's going to look like, maybe you need to put the brakes on and say, okay, we need a better plan.
Well, Martin, as I said, nice to get the perspective from Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks for calling in.
Yeah, thanks.
And it's time for Ask Me Anything with comedians Ali Hassan and Alonzo Bowden.
Ask me anything!
After homeschooling their kids for 2 months, I think a lot of parents were like, I just get this kid out of the house. I don't care. I'll roll the dice. Just get the kid out the house.
I have 4 kids. I love 3 of them. The 3-year-old is just it's a piece of trash. He's not lovable yet. That's not my fault. That's on him. It
is hard enough to be black without Kanye West. Right? Because whenever Kanye starts talking, it's trouble for black people.
Comedy is so much more than about, I got cheated out of 1 minute on stage, oh, my poo joke isn't working the way I want it to. It's just so much bigger than any of that.
These are difficult times, and we figure we could all use a good laugh, but laughs are kind of hard to come by. That's because, like everything else, comedians are affected by COVID-19. Shows have been canceled. Comedy clubs closed in many places in the United States. and Canada. And I don't have to tell you, the news these days, not really so funny. But that has not stopped our two guests today. Ali Hassan will be familiar to many of you who listen to CBC, a stand-up comic, also host of CBC's Canada Reads, which just wrapped up this week. And he just performed in Montreal at a Just for Laughs event at a drive-in theater, and we've reached him in Belleville, Ontario. Alonzo Bowden is also a Just for Laughs veteran. He's a stand-up comedian. He won NBC's Last Comic Standing in 2004 and a frequent panelist on the very funny NPR show Wait, Don't Tell Me. And we've reached Alonzo in Los Angeles today. Ali and Alonzo are here to take your questions, to share a few laughs, and to tell us what it's like to be a comic in the time of COVID. And you can ask them anything. And welcome to both of you.
Hey. Hello. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Ali, let's start with you. A comedy show at a drive-in theater. I can picture it, but I can't really imagine it. What was it like?
Well, there's the sort of March 15th answer, and then there's the post-March 15th answer. In March, if we'd been doing something like this, we would have looked at that and been like, this is dumb. Why are we doing this? There's no ceiling. The DeCarry Expressway is about 30 feet behind me. This doesn't make any sense. We are in a situation now where, no matter what you make of it and what it looked like and what never mind everything. The bottom line was you had performers very, very good at their craft, hungry to perform, get on stage, and you had audience members hungry for comedy. And that's what that show really was at its core. And it was great. It was not ideal comedy. 2 out of the 3 essential, what we have always thought were essential things for comedy, darkness, a ceiling, a low ceiling, those were missing, or at least for the first show, there was no darkness. But anyway, we had a stage, we had great sound, and we had a great audience. So it's almost like that hit that a junkie gets, and you're like, yes, this is why I love this drug. But now you're like, but the drug's out. There's no more drug. Now I have to go searching very hard, far and wide to find my next hit. So that's where I find myself anyway.
Yeah, but I'm still having a hard time completely figuring this out. Like so these are like, did you hear any laughter? Did you get any meaningful feedback?
We could hear laughter. It was actually, I could see people laughing more than I could hear them because there was a beautiful breeze blowing. That was nice, except if the open air didn't take away the laughs enough, the breeze definitely took it away, and it was competing with the expressway behind us. So that was a kind of a tricky situation, but every comic would get off stage, and the other comics would stand in the parking lot and, in the lot of the drive-in, and they would tell the other comics, I tell you, I don't know what you heard, but people were loving it. People were dying, and all of us had that experience. So you could see people laughing, and you could hear a little bit, but yeah, just because of the situation, there were moments where you're like, well, I hope that worked. It felt good coming out of my mouth.
So, Alonzo, you're down in Los Angeles. I assume that you haven't been at comedy clubs. And so have you been able to do virtual shows during the pandemic?
Well, I've done a ton of virtual shows to the point where I'm afraid to say I'm actually getting good at them. But to agree with Ali, on July 3rd, I did a show at the La Jolla Comedy Store. There were about 30 people in the club. They were social distanced. The comics had to wear masks until we walked up on the stage. And doing that 15 minutes in front of live people, like he said, it's that hit of a drug we've been waiting for. It was water in the desert. Like, it felt so good. It reminded me how, doing the Zoom shows, doing the streaming shows, that's working, but it's just not the same. So, yeah, I can do the virtual stuff, but any opportunity to do a live thing, I'll take. I'm going to be doing my first drive-in show in about 2 weeks. So I was listening to him with as much interest as the audience.
Yeah. You know, the NPR show that you're on, Wait, Don't Tell Me, you're a panelist on that. I listen to it every week. And I have to tell you that ever since the show hasn't had an audience, it it's harder to listen to. Like, you guys are really, really funny, but it's interesting to me how much the interaction seems to add some, as a listener, it seems to add some energy and sizzle. As a performer, does it make a big difference for you not to have an audience on that show?
Well, first, let me thank you, because there's nothing more encouraging than knowing we're not as good. That helps. That feels great.
Oh, I wish I had a studio audience now, but go ahead.
No, I'm kidding. The way we're doing the show, so we each record from our respective homes, and we have these digital recorders, so the sound quality is better. And what Peter and the producers have told me is, when they started doing Wait, the first, I guess, 4 or 5 years, or however long, they didn't have a studio audience. They would do it in a radio studio with like 4 panelists, 3 panelists and the host sitting there. So they said to them, it's like going back to the beginning. It's always better if you can be in the same room, right? There's a certain interaction. Even the way we're talking now, you, me, and Ali would be talking different if we could see each other, right? If we were sitting in studio, but this is the new reality. So I think what it is we're all, speaking for comics, we're all figuring it out. We're learning as we go. There was no training for this. So shows like Wait that normally have an audience and now we don't, we just do the best we can.
So Alonzo, let me ask you, is COVID potential grist for the mill? Can you make this funny?
Okay, before I start, I know you Canadians are laughing at us idiots every day because you guys seem to have a handle on it, and we've lost our minds. When the collapse of the United States, when people say what happened, and it's going to be, was it a giant economic collapse? Was it a world? What was like? No, they asked them to wear masks. They asked them to wear masks, and they all killed each other. The funny is in the insanity, just like anything else. So we have the big mask debate that's going on, and just things like that, I think are where we find funny. For me, the idea of let's ignore the scientists and listen to politicians, right? And for a long time, we could laugh at Florida, but now that California has caught up to Florida, I find myself doing fewer Florida jokes.
Well, I can tell you, Alonzo, I was in Montreal this weekend, last night, and we're sitting on an outdoor patio with 2 other comedians, Frank Spadone, John Paul. I think you know Frank.
Yeah, I know
at the very
Frank.
least. We all come from paranoid households. You have our own neuroses. We are being as careful as we can, but we are on an outdoor patio. We're in Montreal. Some bar owner walks by, sees a waitress he knows. The waitress literally jumps in his arms. They kiss on both cheeks. We're like, what is going on here? Some other table, some girl sees an old friend. She's like, oh my God, I haven't seen you in ages. Runs and lunges at her, and they're hugging and almost dancing. And we were like, man, we can't start making fun of the U.S. too quickly, because you never know. You never know. Not everybody is on board with what Canada is prescribing either. So I'm always constantly worried, and as soon as you start joking, that's when it comes back and bites you in the butt too.
We're talking about comedy in the time of COVID. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alonzo.
To be honest with you, Ali, I will kiss someone from Montreal before I say hello to someone in the United States. I'm sorry. We win. Look at the numbers. No. You are winning. I just, compared to myself and Frank and Jean Paul, who are like, doing namastes and judo bows to each other. We saw that. And we were like, oh, not everyone is on the same page in this country either. So we hope for the best. But yeah, as you say, we're pretty concerned for our American brethren right now.
We're speaking to Ali Hassan and Alonzo Bowden, and we're talking about comedy in the time of COVID. And if you have a question, you can call us at 1-888-416-8333, 1-888-416-8333. And Lorenzo Patino is calling from Ottawa. And Lorenzo, you are, I see it described here as a semi-professional stand-up.
Yes. Hi. That means I don't really get paid for it, but I still do it because I love it. So, that's how it goes. I'm sure Ali and Alonzo were there many, many years ago. But I had a question for them in regards to the business of comedy and how reopening has gone here in Ottawa. So we've been open for about a week and a half now. I did my first set on Wednesday with plexiglass in front of the mic and not a lot of crowd. I know the numbers at the two clubs have been somewhat up and down. And I've tried to get friends to come, and it's a pretty hard sell, harder than it was in previous years. And I'm just curious, Ali and Alonzo are both experienced comedians. Do they see the clubs getting through this unscathed, or do you see the way we deliver comedy in the nightclub setting moving into some kind of different model or like a hybrid model? Or and I know Canada's in a different boat than the States, and I guess how does Alonzo see it playing out in the States? I guess that's my question.
Ali,
I can tell you, yeah, sure, man. In my perspective, Alonzo, my feeling is that I would be lying to you, Lorenzo, if I could tell you, here's what's going to happen. I listen to the news and the scientists and I pay attention to all of that, and none of it has given me any indication of any certainty with regards to the questions you're asking. I don't know, man. I just know that my shows that were in the fall got pushed to next year. Now my shows that were in January, February, and March of 2021 have been pushed to the fall of 2021. So those are the trends I'm watching as well. As far as the club that you went to, I don't know if you were at Absolute or Yucks in Ottawa, you go there in the plexiglass and you have 30 people. I still feel like I'm in a very much beggars can't be choosers scenario. And I will take that right now because, as Alonzo and I were both saying, it is a drug, it is a fix, it is a need. And so we'll take it right now. But absolutely, when we start looking at our careers and savings and the foundation that we've built, it's got some cracks in it right now. And I don't personally see exactly, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Let me just say that from my perspective. Alonzo, maybe you could say something more positive than that, but that's what I've got right now.
Well, here in the States, we have such a wide range because there are so many different regulations in different places. For example, here in LA, clubs are not opening, not even thinking about it. It's not going to happen. In Atlanta, I was scheduled to go to Atlanta. I was supposed to be there this weekend. They just canceled last week because there was a battle between the mayor of Atlanta and the governor of the state. Yeah. Where the governor wanted the state open and the mayor was like, no way. Then you have Florida, clubs are open. I'm going to Florida in a few weeks. It's 1/2 capacity, social distanced, etc. Colorado is doing that. Denver is doing that. Reduced capacity clubs, social distance. Some comics are bringing their own microphone. As to whether or not the clubs are going to make it, I think it depends on the individual club. Are they paying rent? Does the club owner own the building where he can keep it there? Do they have other business that they could do? Like some are operating just as a bar or take out food because they have a kitchen. So as to who's going to survive, it really becomes a business question. And that's where I think it's more of the restaurant business will keep you open, or you just have a situation where, you have a good situation with your landlord, or you are the landlord, so you can keep the club. We're going to, unfortunately, like any small business, we're going to lose some clubs, but who knows what it's going to be.
We're speaking to Alonzo Bowden. He is in Los Angeles this afternoon, and Ali Hassan is in Belleville, Ontario, I think. Is that where you live, or are you just on your way back home after being in Montreal?
I'm on my way back home, exactly. We just picked a nice spot with some shade, dropped my daughters off to go run in a field, and come back, in a half an hour.
Excellent.
I'm not a good father. I'm not a good father either.
If you have any questions about comedy in the time of COVID, you can give us a call here, 1-888-416-8333. And, earlier in the program, we were talking about our classrooms safe for return. And we have a call now from Kathleen Wilkinson, who's in Parry Sound, Ontario, that kind of connects comedy and the classroom. Hi, Kathleen.
Hi. I'm also part of a long-term home, so I know what comedy can do for people. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I realize that the atmosphere when we open has to be a little bit free of some of the anxiety that every household is carrying right now, so that your stories that you bring and letting the kids make their own masks. They'll do a wonderful job teaching them some things like sewing and things like that, and maybe some of the parents can help that are screened. But I think we can do a lot more things that make it lighter, because I've lived through 2 pandemics. I've lived through the polio pandemic as well as this COVID one, and I watch the children. I know that when they're involved in keeping things clean and when they're involved in making masks, they do a wonderful job, and that makes it clearer for them. When they go out to play, they have some mitts or gloves, even plastic gloves, to put on, and therefore if they touch anybody else, they're going to be a little more safe than they were before.
Yeah.
The same with seniors who can't find this thing to do anymore. Clothe yourself so that maybe you can go and listen to things. But
right.
I listen to Stuart McLean, and I find that he makes a chuckle in my heart every time. Mm-hmm. And these are the things that we have to do with seniors as well as children, I think.
All right. Okay, Kathleen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alonzo Bowden, you're in Los Angeles and, a veteran of stand-up. You've also been part of the Just for Laughs Festival in Montreal. Is your approach any different now? And you're doing a few virtual shows. You're not obviously doing comedy club shows during the pandemic. But is your approach different now with comedy, since the news is so negative with the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests and how polarized the United States is? Do you find yourself trying to ease up on your humor, or do you use the same approach you always did?
The only thing that I won't go hard on are the innocent victims of this. So that they're the ones, the healthcare workers and the people who just got sick and lost their lives, right? We can't talk about that. But there is so much. For one thing, people have asked, what are comics going to do? We're going to be here because we always tell the truth. Right. That's why I think they need us. Not just funny. We make the truth palatable. So like she was talking about, this is her second pandemic. This is my second riot. OK, I was around for the Rodney King riots. I got experience. And people are like, what are the difference between the 2 riots? Well, this time we invited white people and we found it just worked out so much better. We got better press coverage. The shopping was a little higher end. You know what I mean? So. Yeah. You have to find our job is to find the funny in the misery. Our job is to make the unpalatable palatable. When it comes to Black Lives Matter, there's no way to make the horror of these black people getting killed, beaten, abused by cops. There's no way to make that funny. But there are things that have been a result of it, including the denial of it happening, that we absolutely make funny. People still will look at a video and deny what they see. And that's when, as a comic, we come in and we're going to make fun of you for that, And then when all else fails, there's Kanye. So we got that going for us.
Mm-hmm. Ali Hassan, what about for you? Do you have a different approach to comedy on this terrible 2020?
I side with Alonzo there. I work very hard to punch up almost exclusively. That really should be the goal. There's no reason to punch down. And not only is it an issue that people are dying of COVID, so you do have to be sensitive of that, even when you're joking about it. But we as comedians, we're humans first, and I think a lot of us were miserable too. And then I don't know, somehow that, you remember why you're a comedian. I was in the grocery store early on. There was only one grocery store. It's called T&T Grocers in Mississauga. They said you have to wear a mask. You didn't have to wear a mask indoors yet anywhere. So I put on the mask. I go to my car. I put it on. And I have glasses. And my glasses are large. And immediately glasses start fogging up. And I was like, oh God, I can't see, I can't really breathe, and I'm touching something, and I'm like, oh my God, is somebody beside? Is somebody there? Is somebody there? And I pulled off everything. Anyways, like the zucchini are in front of me. I was like, okay, all right, you know what? I can have fun. I can make fun of this. Anybody who has glasses in an audience will understand this minor panic attack that happens in a warm grocery store. And I can do that. We're going through similar things. So I look for those things, but I'm very, very weary of making sure that people who are sort of, whatever it might be, oppressed or downtrodden or in a bad way, don't listen to something I'm saying and like, okay, well, I just lost a family member to the thing he's making fun of, So I think more than ever, I'm aware of that. And I'm thrilled sometimes when I come across something that I'm like, oh, that's pretty stage worthy. But I found it difficult to go on stage and not talk, at least for the first few minutes, about COVID. I found it very difficult. I couldn't even do it. I couldn't even just get on stage and be like, so anyway, guys, my wife, who cares about my wife? We're all going through something horrible together. Let's address it,
That's Ali Hassan, who's speaking to us from Belleville. He's pulled over on the 401 on his way back to Toronto, I guess, after being at a Just for Laughs drive-in event on the weekend. And Alonzo Bowden is in Los Angeles, and they're talking about comedy in this time of COVID. And of course, COVID is not the only big story this summer, which is a challenge for comedians. You can call us. You can ask them anything. 1-888-416-8333. 1-888-416-8333. Daphne Young is on the line from Winnipeg. And Daphne, you have a call for Ali, a question for Ali.
Yeah, my question's for Ali, but Alonso, you can answer this one too after him if you like. Ali, I read online that you're a chef. So I was wondering, like the rest of us, is there a recipe you perfected during this time of COVID or something new you tried that you really like?
Well, I actually changed my life around a little bit. So I host something called Canada Reads. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. There's a week of it's a competition, a literary competition. It's in mid-March, and I'm already chubby, and then the camera, I just look like a meatball on mid-March. I've hosted for 4 years, so I know what I look like when I don't lose the weight. So I was like, okay, February 1st, I got to do something. I have 6 weeks, so I went plant-based. And, maybe once a month have a pizza, once a month have a burger, but almost exclusively plant-based. And then 48 hours before Canada Reads was supposed to happen, it was postponed indefinitely. And I didn't know so then I just kept going plant-based, much to my children's horror. We have sort of transitioned to eating mostly plant-based food. So I'm focused on more than ever a lot of bean-based, lentil-based dishes, a lot of sweet potato, a lot of greens, the stuff that's on that produce shelf that people are like, I'm not interested in this. I'm taking the beets with the greens, radish greens, dandelion greens, and I've been really kind of, like a simple dal, a lentil dish, I'll add collard greens. I'm making more salads than I've ever made. So yeah, I've had a really kind of a transformation during this time. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me like, wow, if nothing else, I don't know when Canada Reads is going to come back, but if nothing else, you're really building your immunity. And that strengthened my resolve even further. Now, this weekend in Montreal was a disaster for my diet. If anybody was in Montreal with me listening to this, they're like, you liar. I watched you eat that double cheeseburger. But in general, it's been very good and very focused and very light and healthy. And I'm enjoying it.
Alonzo, are you shaking your head? Like, I feel like stand-up comics and healthy eating really is not something that we see a lot of.
No, actually, there are quite a few comics who do well with eating. I'm not one of them. I don't know. I guess my latest thing is to try this intermittent fasting thing, right? So I'm only supposed to eat between noon and 8 p.m. But the problem is I generally find myself on Zoom between like 6 and 8. So it's like, well, I can't eat then, so I got to eat a little later. So I'm adjusting. But it is tough. And I'm not a chef. I don't cook. So it's tougher to eat healthy as a comic because we're not used to doing it, except there are some who are, but for the most part, and I will definitely help the restaurant industry get through the self-quarantine period because I don't order in. I order pickup. I would say, okay, I'm not going to be so lazy that I won't go get it, but I'm not cooking it.
If my
We
kids
have just
were in the
about
car right now, Alonzo, they would be like, why can't that guy be our dad? That's exactly what they would say to me right now.
I only have about a minute.
Restaurant experiences. Sorry,
I
go
only
ahead.
have about, no, it's okay. I just have about a minute left, and I want to hear from both of you just before we go. And just a sense of what's next for you guys, or do you even know what's next? Alonzo?
No idea what's next. AlonzoBowden.com is my website. I have everything on there from Zoom shows to drive-in theaters to live shows. And who knows in a month from now what's going to be going on. I don't know if you've heard about our president, but we have issues.
Ali
Hassan, also not aware of the future. There will be some time on CBC. I just booked a few days on Murdoch Mysteries as they opened up the acting industry. Didn't think a Pakistani was going to land on Murdoch Mysteries, but the future is strange and wild, and it's going to be an interesting ride.
Well, it's really nice to hear from both of you today. And it's interesting. COVID has changed everything, and it's certainly changed comedy as well. Alonzo Bowden in Los Angeles and Ali Hassan in Belleville, Ontario, a rare performance from the side of the highway in Belleville. Thanks to both of you.
My pleasure, man.
Thank you.
Nice to chat with you, Alonzo, brother.
You too, Ali. Take care. Tell Spadone I said hi.
I will.
And that's it for this week. Thank you to everyone who called in today. If you missed part of the program, you can listen again anytime online, cbc.ca/checkup. And keep in mind, you can email us, checkup@cbc.ca, on Twitter and Facebook. You can find us by searching for CheckUp CBC. We'd like to thank all the people who helped with this program: Sabrina Jonas, Chuck Malgat, Felix Pedersen, Susan McKenzie in Montreal, NJ McDonald here in Vancouver helped us out as well, Billy Heaton and Matthias Wolfson. Our program assistant, Mohammed Rashini. Cross Country Checkup produced this week by Steve Howard and Kirthana Sasidaran. Digital producer is Jason Vermesh. Senior producer is Richard Goddard. Thanks for listening. Sheila Rogers will be here in the host chair, broadcasting live from her home in Galiano Island in British Columbia next week. It's our annual summer read special. Get your book picks ready. I'm Ian and Hannah Mansing in Vancouver. Thank you very much for listening to Cross Country Checkup.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.